What happens when we lose our handwriting as a form of creative expression? And what do we miss when we limit tactical creativity to the sports field? And what would change in our schools if we identified the non-negotiables that truly reflect our values and then actually live by them? We'll be discussing this and a lot more in our first debrief of the season. So welcome back to our first debrief of 2026 and also our first debrief of season 1. We've had 3 very exciting guests on the show, haven't we, Cindy?
Yes, we have. We have had Carlos Moreno, who is the CEO of Big Picture Learning. And then we had Holly Brighton, who talked to us about handwriting and creativity. And then we had Daniel Memmert, who is a researcher in the area of sports and creativity. So it has been a really interesting first section of our podcast. And Matt, I think, we set out this year that we wanted to have different conversations on our podcast that we have never had before. And I think this first part, we definitely achieved that.
Absolutely. And we won't start our debrief yet, but I think in some ways, I would say at least 2 of the 3 episodes were almost like outliers. Like they were topics that we haven't really spoken about ever before. Like you could even make a connection. So I certainly know that I found myself making new discoveries and going back and thinking about things and connections with creativity and these topics in ways that I'd never done before, thanks to these wonderful guests. So what was your first takeaway?
All right, so let's talk about Carlos Moreno, who heads up the Big Picture Learning. And I was really excited about having him on the show because I have been in a big picture school here in Buffalo, New York, through a friend of mine, Karen Monaco, who is a vice principal. And I have worked with some of the students at Big Picture Learning. So I was really excited to meet with him, and he did not disappoint. Because what I loved about what he said was that we need, right now we are building school systems and then we're trying to fit our students into those school systems. But what we should be doing is looking at our students and then bringing in the education and curricula into the schools to fit the students, so not vice versa. And I think I knew that intuitively, but it was never articulated to me in that way. And I just love that because I think, as we talk about how we start to shift education, I think that's a good place to start is really by looking at students and empowering them through their communities, which he talked a lot about as well, and really thinking about how do we make those connections between the student and what they're interested in and taking on projects with their communities and becoming, creative in a transformational way, as we've talked about before, both in our book and with Dr. Robert Sternberg, Transformational Creativity.
And it was interesting that you brought up the community piece because my mind went back to our interview. I can't remember what season it was, but with AJ Craybill, who you remember was a consultant with school advisory boards. And a big piece of that conversation with him was the importance of, as you're setting goals and thinking about what do you want this school to look like, what is its mission statement, bringing in the community because, and I think Carlos spoke about this as well, but schools are at the heart of communities, right? And we're all probably can relate to this, and this is one of those kind of like given things, but whenever you're thinking about society and looking toward the future, quite often schools are a big part of that, of how you achieve that. But reminding us that, yes, there are obviously national objectives, but we do need to think at the local level, and thinking at the local level also includes thinking about the students who we are serving. So I totally agree with you, and it was wonderful to actually have a conversation about what that looks like in action from one of the leaders at a school that's trying to work, or rather a collection of schools that are trying to do just that.
Yes, 150 there. He talked about 150 schools around the world. So, if you think about that connection between the community and the students, I think we need to be doing more of that. And I think that also helps them. If you think about students, and I think about, he also mentioned, being a champion, like every student needs a champion. And I remember talking almost the same conversation with Principal L many seasons ago about finding students creative champions. And I think people in the community can be creative champions. So for me, it was also, how do we do more of that outside of big picture schools? Find mentors for students that may not have a champion inside of their own scope of the world, right? So what do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. And actually, now you're getting me to think a little bit just about the model itself. I mean, I referenced on that episode, and I've referenced previously in the podcast that I was fortunate enough to, while working at the Center for 21st Century Skills, we had this investing in innovation grant. And we were tasked with, in essence, we used to say, putting a school within a school. And it provided us, we had that freedom to kind of experiment and explore with what might a STEM educational experience look like for a cohort of between 18 and 25 high school students from 9th till 12th grade. And, we had to kind of think creatively and strategically about how we put that experience together. And then ultimately, we were looking for school partners who were willing to go and actually implement what was called the Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences. So schools would quite literally go and sign up to it. And then as new students were coming in from middle school, they would kind of either apply or opt to be part of the Academy of Digital Arts and Sciences.
Mhm.
And I think this idea, just talking to Carlos, and the fact that there are different models and it's not always about having to have a completely new building or a completely new skill. There's opportunity sometimes to partner with someone like Big Picture Schools who have their own school as well as working with existing schools with their model. That we should be facilitating and doing more of those relationships, because for whatever reason, if we are perhaps struggling to do the creative things that we want to do in our school because perhaps we've got other priorities, then we're in
Yep.
a situation where we can actually bring in outsiders to kind of focus in and bring that creativity into those schools. So I think that's something that Carlos and Big Picture Schools are doing, and something that I truly valued as well.
Hmm. So let's hear your insights.
You know what? In some ways, it kind of builds on what I just said, and so thinking about the fact that you're going in and you're working with the school. What I really liked was when Carlos said, "Look, there are some things that are not negotiable." So while we recognize that
Mm.
our program or our experience might take on different flavors or have slightly different ingredients at each school,
Mhm.
which kind of makes sense to what you said as well, because the community might be different, the areas of focus might be different. There are some non-negotiables, and I'm not going to go through all of the non-negotiables. I'm simply going to talk a little bit about, you was referencing champions, but this idea of kind of one-to-ones and the
Mm.
advising piece. And Carlos was quite rightly saying, look, everyone has these kind of like advisory experiences. I mean, even at the university level, we have these advisory experiences, but they can look and feel very differently. And
Mm.
so what Carlos, what I took from that episode is that if you want to kind of implement our model, one of the non-negotiables is that you're going to go and deliver an excellent advising session, which
Mm.
has a mentor, or to your words, a champion, working one-to-one regularly with an individual student. And that speaks to values as well. That's something that Big Picture Schools say, look, this is something we
Mm.
greatly value, and therefore this is non-negotiable. And I just found myself wondering, wow, how many schools have identified values that they have and that they say this is non-negotiable. It's
Yep.
non-negotiable in your classrooms. It's non-negotiable when it comes to extracurricular activities. It's non-negotiable when it comes to sports and everything else we're doing in this district, in this building. These are the non-negotiable things, and really working out exactly what that looks like.
Man, I love that. And I think, so many schools have values in their mission and vision and values. And, you read their values and you know the school and you think, they're not really hitting the mark. But if you have those non-negotiables and that administrator stands up and says, this is a non-negotiable, and this is what I want to see every day when I'm walking through the school and when I walk into your classroom, I think that's a really powerful way to frame it. And I think it can't be, you have 10 non-negotiables or 50 non-negotiables. You have to have maybe just a couple. What is it that is at the heart of what you value? And so I think it's a deeper level of values, what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Deeper levels of value. And it's about implementation and making sure it's looks like and sounds like in exactly the same way. And of course, that requires training.
Mm.
It
Yep.
requires you to go and have accountability measures in place, even though we don't like those accountability measures. It's not about catching out and saying, you're not doing it, but it's more a case of we need to maybe provide you some support and assistance to make
Mhm.
sure that it's being done the way we say it's being done. Because I didn't even think about that, but yeah, every school has them. You go on a school website and they've
Yep.
all got that kind of mission statement that expresses their values. Quite often they're very similar to each other,
Yep.
but you're right. How often do schools really say, are we really following through on that?
Yeah. All right. Tell me about Holly Brighton. What did you learn from her episode?
Very cool. So we switched to me starting.
Yeah.
First of all, I like look, having a conversation about the value of writing
Hmm.
in the future is something that I was just really fascinated about. And I'd kind of, had mentioned before the interview that because my boys are at parochial school, handwriting is something that they have. There's basically a lot of time and energy that goes into handwriting. And there are people that raise questions about that, but all three of my boys have beautiful handwriting. And you spoke a little bit about cursive, and they all have cursive. So
Hmm.
my first thought was, to what extent are they actually using that in the real world? And that's one conversation. But another part of the discussion that I found fascinating was the idea that writing is a modality of creative connection. It's a modality to connecting ideas, that are occurring in your head. And so it actually is less about penmanship. And I remember Holly referencing that. It's less about penmanship and it's more about being able to quickly express those thoughts on a page. And suddenly, as the interview progressed, it was like we might lose that. We might literally be losing the capacity to express your ideas on a page, that mini C creativity. Just think about how often that mini C creativity is
Mm.
expressed in some shape or form through writing on a page. And
Mm.
and then suddenly we might lose that. Well, where else? How else are you expressing it? And it could be that there might be other forms of expression. I'm open to that conversation, but I certainly don't think we've been sitting down and having a conversation about the potential impact of not having the ability to do that.
And what that does for our creativity. I
Mhm.
agree. And I think what was really striking to me, and I would love to hear from the teachers listening to our podcast, is the fact that she said that handwriting, not even cursive, because I knew cursive wasn't being taught as much in schools, but handwriting in general is not being taught in schools. And that was kind of shocking to me. I'll be honest. I was like, wait. They're not teaching handwriting at all? So how are we supposed to articulate our ideas or their ideas? And as I mentioned in that episode, when you look at AI and students now having to like handwrite essays, how are they going to be able to do that if they don't know how to So I think that's what really struck me in her episode was just that lack and what's happening as a result. And I feel like I need to do some research to really understand that more. Maybe we ask Jimmy if he could look into that for us. The
You know what's
actual
really You know what's really funny is I had a note to say we need to do a shout out to Jimmy Wilson when he's listening to this episode, just to say that, first of all, there was a few occasions on the show where Holly had referenced that science supports exactly what you're
Yes.
saying.
Yeah.
So we should definitely bring Jimmy on to kind of like unpack some of that science a little bit.
Mm.
So yes, Jimmy, if you're listening, that's a call to action, and hopefully we can pick some of that up later. But one of the things that you said just then that got me thinking a little bit more is, have we intentionally stopped teaching writing? And if the answer is kind of like, no, we haven't intentionally, like there hasn't been someone sat around and said, you know what, let's stop teaching handwriting. We don't have to do that no more. And it's simply just become something that's drifted away because of all of the other priorities that teachers are having to address.
Right.
And we're in this situation that because it's not being tested, because there's not workshops saying you must do this and must do that, teachers have just let it go by the wayside. My now question is, well, what else are we currently losing right now? Like that kind
Yeah.
of worries me a little bit. Like, are we losing? I don't think we're losing drawing, right? But like, I'm sitting there, I'm like, what else might we be losing?
Right. Well, even like fine motor skills, if you think about like holding a pencil and being able to craft something with a pencil. Like, has that
Mhm.
gone away? I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah. Might we, it sounds crazy, but might we get to a scenario where people don't know the difference between cities and states and countries because we can
Yeah.
unintentionally lose the teaching of things in education? That's worrying.
Yeah. It is worrying.
Tell us about Daniel Memmott.
So I thought Daniel's episode was really interesting because I don't know that much about sports, and I've never thought more than a fleeing thought in passing a soccer field what creativity would look like in sports. It's just not my area. So I really enjoyed the novelty of his episode. And I think what really struck me was the term tactical creativity, which, I went back and looked at that definition that he gave for tactical creativity, which is unexpected and appropriate. And thinking about teaching divergent thinking to students, particularly when they're at a young age, to look at all the different ways they can do something. But it also has, so it can be unexpected in sports, but also appropriate in that it's going to be effective. So it has to be those two things, unexpected and appropriate, in order to be tactical creativity. And I just thought that was a really interesting piece and something that I feel like I can now relate to, let's say, teachers who are in sports education and physical education, because that's, typically if I go into a school and they say, oh, well, you have the physical education teachers there, and they're like, well, how does this relate to me? Now I can point to tactical creativity and go a little bit deeper into that.
Yeah, and you know what? I wasn't planning on talking about tactical creativity, but just to try and take this concept and just take it outside of sports. We are so often, there's so many different domains or situations where we are trained a certain way to behave and respond to situations in a particular way,
Mhm.
and they're ultimately those ways of responding are because hopefully they've been deemed effective. Like there's evidence to say this is the best way to approach that situation and approach that situation effectively. But there are scenarios, as we know, disruptions, the unexpected happens, and so in that moment, you're then tasked to say, okay, this isn't working. You've
Mm.
got to do something else. And my feeling was that in that situation, if you've got that tactical creativity, again,
Mhm.
we could come away from sports for a moment, and therefore you've got the ability to say, okay, I'm going to switch it up. I've got options. I can generate ideas that are available to me for me to then quickly go through and identify which of those ideas are most appropriate right now. Now I've got another option.
Mm.
And you just wonder how many times, both on the sports field and off the sports field, where someone can perform so well at a repetitive task, but then suddenly, when that repetitive task is no longer working, they
Mm.
kind of freeze and they don't know what else to do. Versus someone else who doesn't freeze and say, okay, I'm going to switch and do that. And
Mm.
to your point, that tactical creativity, I think there's a lot of things to talk about and potentially repurpose it in different areas other than sports.
Mm. Okay, Matt, I know you were anticipating Daniel's episode because you were really excited about the sports and creativity. So, was it all that you hoped it would be? And what did you walk away with?
Oh, I loved it. I mean, it was definitely great, and I'm aware that I definitely steered the conversation very sports centric, and I spoke a little bit about coaches, and I spoke about the players and how we can nurture a tactical creativity. How players. We spoke a little bit about risk taking. So of course, I want to kind of delve deeper into all of the relationship, all of the connections I saw to my kids playing sports and my experience with kids in sports. But there was one comment that I loved that I thought, again, is applicable beyond sports. And it came from when I was asking Daniel, I believe the question was something along how do coaches find this balance of teaching students, or rather players, what they must do in a situation while also making sure that there's the door open that if that situation is not effective, like I just said around tactical creativity, they've got the option to explore something else. And he said, you don't use the word must.
Mm,
And it really kind of, I went away and I said, wow, how often do we
mm,
say in a science or anything with our kids, you must do it this way, you know? No, no,
mhm,
no. We must do it like this.
mhm.
And obviously, we've got to now find another word that suggests that, hey, you nearly should be doing it like this most of the time. But if you realize it doesn't work, you can do what you just did. But I don't
Mm,
want you do what you just did now. I have
mm.
no idea what that word is, but Daniel's position is that it's not the word must. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, but that was a big takeaway for me.
I think that's an interesting takeaway. I wonder if it's like, well, it could be, maybe you should consider. Would that work?
You know what? From a sports perspective, you've got a lot of players that are like, like doing extra dribbling, going past the extra player, a little bit too
Uh-huh.
much. It's like, no, I need you to. In fact, classic example right now, I'll switch sports, is basketball. All right. I got all of these young kids that are trying to score 3-pointers. And and I've spoke with a friend who's coaching the higher grades, and he says you can't get the kids doing 3-pointers because they change their whole body position, right? So
Yeah.
I'm saying I don't want you doing 3-pointers. In that scenario, you must do this, right? Um, so, and they keep ignoring me. Like going back to your question, they keep ignoring me. So I can't leave the door open. Have you ever considered not doing a 3-pointer because you can't reach the rim?
Okay, so that doesn't work. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what makes it fascinating, because these are kids, so we kind of have to say, you know, have you ever considered that might be too high for you? You know, you might break your neck if you do that. Have you ever considered that, that the ink's going to get all over your pants if you do that? So I suppose it's about identifying the appropriate times when you don't have to use the word must. Perhaps
Well,
that's what it.
yeah, and I also wonder if it's about having them think. So this is sort of getting into metacognition, having them think through
Mm,
what happens when they're always shooting, the 3-pointers. Like how does that what does that do to their bodies? How does that impact how they play in the actual game, right? So what if
yeah.
getting them to like, all right, let's go back on this. Do you remember when we had Joe Bowler on the podcast and she talked about mathish and she was talk about your process of,
Mm.
doing math, but think about that in the terms of shooting baskets. So tell me about the process when you're going to shoot the ball. Tell me what's happening. So talk through everything that's going on for you.
I'm
Would that
liking that a
apply?
lot. Yeah,
Would
I'm
that
liking that.
apply to sports?
Yeah, I actually think it does. And you know what? Now we can go back to what we said at the very beginning. But it's about probably identifying your values and what's
Mhm.
non-negotiable. And in this scenario, that requires one-on-one. And I've often, to bring this into sports, I think there's not enough one-on-ones in the many of these sports, you know, academies or teaching experiences. And of course, perhaps that comes down to time again, but it is quite often too much around. Oh, I was going to say it's too much around teamwork. I like the fact. I like the fact that it's about teamwork and teaching the team to win. But
Mhm.
I think we do need some one on ones, and I think those one on ones are when you can have those conversations.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe it's about bringing those one on ones so you do get the chance to ask those questions. Did you
Mm.
ever consider this as an option?
Mm.
Yeah, love that. Particularly, actually, when things aren't working. But that's what I was told to do. I know. And that is what usually works. But when
Mm.
it's not working, have you ever considered this as an alternative option?
Mm.
Yeah, I love that, Cindy. Okay, so for our takeaway of this first debrief, we want to kind of go back to something that we had shared in our kind of end of year show going into 2026 show. And in that, we invited you, our guests, to provide us with some suggestions on where we might go with the book when it comes to engaging our audience, whether it might be monthly webinars, maybe regular meetups, potentially, some online learning experiences. And ultimately, we had said that we would put a form in the episode show notes, and we said anyone who fills out that form gets invited to our 5-year anniversary, most likely virtual party, though possibly turning into an episode. We haven't kind of worked all of those things out yet, but we forgot to put in the show notes. And the reason why we've got to put in the show notes is that we are only a kindergartner episode. We're only 5 years old. So that's what happens. And we realized our mistake. And so we're going back and we're inviting you again to fill out that form and provide us with some suggestions and ideas on how we can potentially support you. And the reason why the timing of this is also really important is that Cindy and I do like to utilize the summer to produce some content that supports you in your professional learning. I know it might feel far away right now, but just having this information is really going to assist us as we start planning for that, probably around April, early May. So please fill out the form to this link. And as I said, we will invite you to that special celebratory 5-year anniversary of our podcast. So that's the call to action, and we'll end it there. My name is Dr. Matthew Worwood.
And my name is Dr. Cindy Burnett. This episode was produced by Cindy Burnett and Matthew Worwood. Our podcast assistant is Ann Fernando, and our editor is Sheikh Ahmed.